Picture this. It's 1720, and you're standing on a moonlit dock in Boston Harbor. Shadows move in the darkness as barrels of French wine and Caribbean molasses change hands. No customs duties paid, no questions asked. The men handling these goods aren't lone wolves operating in desperation. They're part of a sophisticated network that spans from the Caribbean to London, involving merchants, ship captains, corrupt officials, and even respected community leaders. In a world without police departments, detective bureaus, or forensic labs, these criminal enterprises flourished in ways that would make modern organized crime bosses envious. But here's the shocking truth. Many of these criminals were your neighbors, your local shopkeeper, even your town's magistrate. In colonial America, the line between respectable citizen and criminal mastermind was razor-thin, and the absence of formal law enforcement created a perfect storm for organized crime to thrive. Today, we're diving into the shadowy underworld of colonial American crime rings, smuggling operations that funded revolutions, counterfeiting schemes that threatened entire economies, and trading networks so brutal they still haunt our collective conscience. This is the untold story of how America's first organized criminals built empires without a single police officer to stop them. To understand how organized crime flourished in colonial America, we must first grasp a fundamental truth. The colonies existed in a legal vacuum, unlike anything we can imagine today. Between the 1600s and the American Revolution, there were no police departments, no detectives, no fingerprint databases, and certainly no FBI. Law enforcement, such as it was, consisted of a patchwork of outdated English traditions ill-suited to the American frontier. The primary law enforcement officers were constables and sheriffs, positions often filled by reluctant citizens serving temporary appointments. A constable in 1700s Philadelphia might be a cobbler one year and a blacksmith the next, with little to no training and even less enthusiasm for pursuing dangerous criminals. These men had no uniforms, carried no badges, and possessed minimal legal authority beyond their immediate communities. Sheriffs, while more permanent, were typically political appointees more concerned with collecting taxes and serving court papers than investigating complex criminal conspiracies. The legal system itself was Byzantine and inconsistent. Each colony operated under different laws. Many borrowed haphazardly from English common law but adapted, or ignored, based on local needs. Massachusetts operated under Puritan law, Virginia under Anglican traditions, and Pennsylvania under Quaker principles. This legal fragmentation created jurisdictional nightmares. A criminal wanted in Boston could simply cross into Rhode Island and become effectively invisible. There was no system for sharing information between colonies, no wanted posters circulated beyond local taverns, and no coordinated response to criminal networks operating across colonial borders. Maritime commerce dominated the colonial economy, and the Atlantic Ocean became both highway and hideout for criminal enterprises. The complex web of trade regulations imposed by the British Crown, the Navigation Acts, customs duties, and trade monopolies created enormous financial incentives for smuggling. These weren't simply unfair laws, they were often economically crushing. When Britain required that all colonial sugar, tobacco, and cotton be shipped exclusively to England, often at prices below market value, then taxed the imports colonists needed, they essentially invited widespread smuggling as an economic necessity. The physical landscape of colonial America also enabled criminal operations. Vast stretches of wilderness separated communities. Coastlines featured countless hidden coves and inlets perfect for clandestine cargo transfers. Communication traveled at the speed of horse or ship, weeks or months for information to spread. A smuggling operation in Charleston might not be discovered by authorities in Boston until months after the cargo had been sold and the profits distributed. The criminals always had a massive head start. Perhaps most importantly, colonial society harbored deeply ambivalent attitudes towards certain crimes. Smuggling, in particular, was often viewed as patriotic resistance to unjust British taxation rather than criminal behavior. Many colonists saw smugglers not as lawbreakers, but as economic heroes providing affordable goods and striking blows against crown tyranny. This social acceptance provided criminal networks with protection, funding, and recruitment opportunities that formal criminal gangs could only dream of. Into this perfect storm of absent law enforcement, legal chaos, geographic advantages, and social acceptance stepped America's first organized crime rings, sophisticated, ruthless, and remarkably successful. When we think of John Hancock today, we picture the bold signature on the Declaration of Independence, a symbol of American patriotism. But before he was a founding father, Hancock was one of colonial America's most successful smuggling kingpins, running a criminal enterprise that would rival any modern organized crime operation. Hancock inherited his uncle Thomas Hancock's mercantile business in 1764, but the real inheritance was something far more valuable: an established smuggling network spanning Boston, the Caribbean, and Europe. The operation was stunningly sophisticated. Hancock's ships, including his flagship vessel the Liberty, would sail to the Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius, a notorious smuggling haven where no questions were asked. There, they would load up with French wine, Dutch textiles, and Caribbean molasses, all without paying British customs duties that could amount to 50% or more of the cargo's value. The smuggling technique was elaborate. Ships would approach Boston Harbor at night, anchoring in isolated coves along the Massachusetts coast. Small boats would offload the illegal cargo, which was then transported overland to Hancock's warehouses. To avoid suspicion, Hancock maintained meticulous official records showing legal imports from British territories, all fabricated. The man kept two sets of books, one for the customs officials and one for his actual business. But Hancock didn't operate alone. His network included ship captains who specialized in evading British patrol vessels, dock workers who could unload cargo in darkness without leaving evidence, warehouse managers who concealed contraband behind legitimate goods, and most crucially, corrupt customs officials who could be bribed to overlook discrepancies in shipping manifests. One customs official, Benjamin Hallowell, was on Hancock's payroll, providing advance warning of inspections and falsifying records. The scale was enormous. Historians estimate Hancock smuggled goods worth millions in today's currency annually. The operation employed dozens directly and hundreds indirectly. It wasn't just one man. It was organized crime with hierarchies, specializations, and coordinated operations across multiple jurisdictions. The British eventually caught on. In 1768, customs officials seized the Liberty, claiming Hancock had unloaded illegal wine under cover of darkness. The case became a political firestorm. Hancock hired John Adams, yes, that John Adams, as his attorney. Adams argued that the customs seizure was illegal and that British regulations themselves were unjust. Hancock was never convicted, partly because intimidated witnesses refused to testify, and partly because the entire Boston community saw him as a hero, not a criminal. The Hancock case reveals something crucial. In colonial America, organized smuggling wasn't viewed as criminal activity but as economic resistance. Hancock's crime ring included some of Boston's most prominent citizens, merchants, lawyers, even clergy. The same network that smuggled wine and molasses would later smuggle weapons and ammunition for the Continental Army. The line between patriot and criminal was blurred beyond recognition. While smuggling dominated maritime colonies, inland regions faced a different criminal threat: counterfeiting. In an era when colonies issued their own paper currency, and when printing technology was relatively simple, counterfeiting became America's first major organized financial crime. Owen Sullivan ran the most sophisticated counterfeiting operation in colonial history. Operating primarily in New York and Connecticut during the 1750s and 1760s, Sullivan wasn't some lone counterfeiter working from a basement. He organized what modern law enforcement would recognize as a criminal syndicate with specialized roles, territorial divisions, and sophisticated money laundering operations. Sullivan's organization had three distinct branches. The production team consisted of skilled engravers who could replicate the intricate designs on colonial currency. These weren't amateurs. They were trained craftsmen, often lured from legitimate employment with promises of wealth. The distribution network included dozens of passers, individuals who would travel to distant towns and exchange counterfeit bills for real goods or legitimate currency. Finally, Sullivan employed enforcers who used intimidation and violence to prevent detection, eliminate competitors, and silence potential informants. The operation worked like this. Sullivan's engravers, working in hidden workshops in rural Connecticut, would produce counterfeit bills, primarily New York and Connecticut currency. The quality was so good that even experienced merchants struggled to detect the fakes. The counterfeit notes would be distributed to passers, who received them at 20–30% of face value. These passers would then travel to remote towns where they weren't known, making small purchases to receive real currency as change, or selling goods to receive payment in their own counterfeit bills mixed with legitimate money. The geographic dispersal was crucial. By the time a shopkeeper realized they'd been given counterfeit currency, the passer was long gone, possibly in another colony entirely. With no police force and no way to quickly communicate between towns, there was virtually no way to track the criminals. Sullivan himself remained insulated from risk, never directly handling the counterfeit money. The scale of Sullivan's operation threatened entire colonial economies. In 1756, Connecticut officials estimated that 1/3 of all currency in circulation might be counterfeit. This created a crisis of confidence. Merchants refused to accept paper money, demanding only coins or goods in trade. The colonial economy, already fragile, teetered on the brink of collapse. Sullivan's downfall came not through law enforcement but through betrayal. In 1756, one of his passers, caught with counterfeit bills, agreed to inform on the operation in exchange for leniency. Even then, it took months to locate Sullivan's workshop. When authorities finally raided it in 1756, they found elaborate engraving equipment, thousands of counterfeit bills, and detailed records of the distribution network. Sullivan was convicted and hanged in 1756, but many of his associates escaped, and new counterfeit operations soon emerged to fill the void. No discussion of organized crime in colonial America can ignore the most brutal and profitable criminal enterprise of all, the illegal slave trade. While slavery itself was legal, certain aspects of the slave trade violated British law, international treaties, and even some colonial regulations. Yet sophisticated networks of merchants, ship captains, and financiers built fortunes on what was essentially organized human trafficking. Rhode Island became the center of American slave trading, particularly after 1750. The infamous triangle trade worked as follows. Rhode Island ships would sail to West Africa carrying rum, distilled from Caribbean molasses. In Africa, the rum was traded for enslaved people, who were then transported under horrific conditions to the Caribbean in the infamous Middle Passage. There, the enslaved people were sold, and the ships loaded Caribbean molasses and sugar, which was brought back to Rhode Island to produce more rum. The cycle continued, generating enormous profits at every stage. The criminal sophistication lay in how these networks operated outside or around existing laws. The 1807 Act prohibiting importation of slaves made it illegal to bring enslaved Africans into the United States, yet the trade continued for decades. Rhode Island merchants developed elaborate schemes to circumvent the law. The DeWolf family of Bristol, Rhode Island, ran perhaps the most extensive illegal slave trading operation in American history. Between 1769 and 1820, the DeWolf fleet made over 80 slave trading voyages, transporting an estimated 12,000 enslaved Africans. After 1807, when the trade became explicitly illegal, the DeWolf simply adapted their criminal enterprise. Ships would be registered under foreign flags, often Spanish or Portuguese, to avoid U.S. jurisdiction. Manifests would be falsified to show legal cargo like textiles or rum. Ships would take circuitous routes, stopping at multiple ports to obscure their true destinations. Some vessels would transfer enslaved people at sea to other ships, making tracking impossible. Insurance fraud was common. Ships would be deliberately overinsured, then lost at sea with their human cargo, allowing the merchants to profit twice. The network required corruption at multiple levels. Port officials had to be bribed to overlook suspicious cargo or falsified paperwork. Ships' crews had to be recruited, who would remain silent about the illegal cargo, men hardened enough not to be troubled by the horrific conditions below decks. Financiers in Boston, New York, and even London provided capital while maintaining plausible deniability. The scale was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1807 and 1860, American smugglers illegally imported at least 50,000 enslaved Africans, possibly many more. The profits were enormous. A successful voyage could return 100% profit or more. For context, James DeWolf became one of the richest men in America through slave trading, serving as a U.S. senator while simultaneously running illegal slaving operations. What made this organized crime rather than individual criminal acts was the systemic nature. Established networks, specialized roles, corruption of officials, coordinated operations across multiple jurisdictions, and long-term strategic planning. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were criminal enterprises that operated for generations. The line between legal privateering and organized piracy was razor-thin in colonial waters, and some criminal networks exploited this ambiguity ruthlessly. During wartime, colonial governments issued letters of marque, legal documents authorizing private ships to attack enemy vessels and seize their cargo. This was privateering. Without such authorization, the same acts would be piracy, punishable by death. Clever criminals figured out how to game this system, creating what amounted to organized piracy with a legal veneer. The Philadelphia privateering racket of the 1740s-1760s exemplifies this perfectly. During King George's War, 1744-1748, and the French and Indian War, 1754-1763, Philadelphia merchants organized privateering ventures that looked legal on paper but operated as criminal enterprises. Here's how the scheme worked. Merchants would obtain letters of marque from colonial governors, sometimes through legitimate channels, sometimes through bribes. These documents authorized attacks on French and Spanish shipping. However, the criminal networks would then attack neutral ships, British vessels, or even American colonial ships, falsifying records to claim the victims were legitimate enemy targets. When a ship was seized, the cargo would be brought to Philadelphia, where corrupt prize courts, legal bodies established to determine if seized goods were legitimate war prizes, would rule in favor of the privateers, regardless of the actual circumstances. The judges were often business partners with the privateer owners or received kickbacks from the sales. The organization was complex. At the top were wealthy merchants who financed the privateering voyages, men like William Clymer and Thomas Willing. These financiers provided capital but insulated themselves from direct criminal activity. Ship captains, recruited from both legitimate maritime commerce and outright piracy, commanded the vessels. Crews were recruited with promises of prize shares, the 18th century equivalent of splitting the take after a heist. Lawyers specialized in navigating prize court proceedings, using legal technicalities to legitimize stolen goods. And crucially, the network included corrupt government officials who would issue letters of marque with minimal questions asked, and prize court judges who would rule favorably regardless of evidence. The scale was massive. Between 1744 and 1748, Philadelphia privateers captured over 200 vessels. While some were legitimate enemy ships, historians estimate that 30–40% were either neutral vessels or victims of outright piracy. The economic impact was enormous. The cargo from a single captured merchant ship could be worth 10,000 to 20,000 pounds, millions in today's currency. The criminal enterprise only functioned because of the absence of effective law enforcement. There was no naval police force to patrol colonial waters and verify that privateers were following their legal mandates. Prize court decisions were final, with no appeals process that could be practically accessed. And the colonial governments themselves had financial incentives to look the other way, as they received a percentage of all prize sales. The privateering racket collapsed after 1763, when peace eliminated the legal cover of war. Many of the same networks simply transitioned into smuggling operations during the Stamp Act crisis, demonstrating the fluid nature of organized crime in colonial America. The flourishing of organized crime in colonial America had profound and lasting impacts on society, economy, and the development of American legal culture. Understanding these effects helps explain not just historical patterns, but also how criminal enterprises shape communities even today. Organized crime rings created massive wealth inequality. Successful smugglers like John Hancock became fabulously wealthy while honest merchants who paid customs duties struggled to compete. This economic advantage allowed criminal enterprises to invest in legitimate businesses, purchase political influence, and establish themselves as respected community leaders. The same pattern persists today, where organized crime profits are laundered into legitimate enterprises, distorting markets and rewarding illegal behavior. Counterfeiting operations destabilized colonial economies, creating inflation, destroying confidence in paper currency, and making trade increasingly difficult. When 1/3 of Connecticut's currency was counterfeit in the 1750s, the colony faced economic collapse. Merchants demanded only hard currency or barter, which slowed economic growth and harmed ordinary citizens who relied on paper money for daily transactions. The economic chaos benefited those with resources to weather the storm while devastating working-class families. Perhaps the most damaging impact was the complete undermining of legal authority and respect for law. When prominent citizens like John Hancock openly operated smuggling networks, when judges could be bribed to validate stolen cargo, and when colonial officials themselves participated in illegal operations, the concept of rule of law became meaningless. Why should an ordinary colonist respect laws when the wealthy and powerful flagrantly violated them with impunity? This created a cultural norm of selective law enforcement based on social status and wealth, a pattern that persists in American society. The rich merchant smuggling wine faced no consequences, while a poor laborer stealing bread might be publicly whipped. This double standard bred cynicism about justice that echoed through American history. Organized crime required community complicity to function. Dock workers unloaded smuggled cargo. Warehouse owners stored illegal goods. Shopkeepers accepted counterfeit currency. Neighbors remained silent about slave ships preparing for illegal voyages. This mass participation in criminal activity created a culture of moral compromise. Many colonists justified their participation through political rationalization. Smuggling was resistance to unjust British laws. Counterfeiting was fighting against economic oppression. But this rationalization had costs. Communities became accustomed to ignoring certain crimes, creating moral gray zones where illegal behavior was normalized. The same communities that sheltered smugglers also often ignored domestic violence, tolerating abuse because it's not our business. Once a culture of looking the other way takes root, it spreads beyond its original justification. While we often romanticize colonial smugglers as swashbuckling heroes, the reality involved significant violence. Criminal networks used intimidation to silence witnesses, eliminate competitors, and enforce internal discipline. The Owen Sullivan counterfeiting gang murdered informants. Privateering crews tortured captured sailors to reveal cargo locations. Slave traders committed unspeakable atrocities. Communities living with organized crime networks experienced chronic fear. Cross a smuggling operation, and your shop might burn down. Testify against a criminal, and your family might face retaliation. This climate of fear corroded social trust and democratic participation. People learned to keep their heads down and mind their own business. The infiltration of government institutions by criminal interests had lasting consequences. When governors issued letters of marque in exchange for bribes, when customs officials took payoffs to falsify records, and when judges ruled based on kickbacks rather than evidence, it established patterns of corruption that proved remarkably durable. These corrupt networks often persisted across generations. The same families involved in illegal slave trading in the 1750s were still wielding political power in the 1850s, using that influence to protect economic interests built on criminal foundations. Breaking these entrenched corruption networks would require the development of professional, reformed law enforcement, a process that took over a century. The organized crime rings of colonial America may seem distant, but their echoes resonate powerfully in contemporary American society. The patterns they established and the problems they revealed remain strikingly relevant to modern discussions about policing, organized crime, and justice. Colonial America's lack of professional police created the perfect environment for organized crime to flourish. Today, we see similar patterns in regions with weak law enforcement institutions. Whether in failed states, remote areas with minimal police presence, or communities where police-community relations have completely broken down, organized crime fills power vacuums. The modern debate over defunding the police must grapple with this historical lesson. While reforming problematic police practices is essential, the complete absence of effective law enforcement historically enabled organized crime networks that victimized communities for generations. The colonial experience suggests we need not absence of law enforcement but transformation, replacing corrupt, ineffective, or abusive systems with professional, accountable, community-centered policing. John Hancock's smuggling empire reveals an uncomfortable truth. Societies often celebrate criminals who look respectable and share the majority culture's values. Hancock was wealthy, white, educated, and politically connected. His criminality was forgiven, even celebrated as patriotic. This pattern persists today. White-collar criminals, often wealthy, respected members of society, receive dramatically lighter sentences and social condemnation than street criminals committing far less harmful offenses. A banker who orchestrates a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme might serve minimal prison time and maintain social respectability, while someone stealing a few $100s faces years in prison and lifelong stigma. Colonial America's differential treatment of respectable smugglers versus common thieves established a double standard we haven't overcome. The infiltration of colonial governments by criminal interests mirrors modern concerns about corporate capture of regulatory agencies and corrupt officials enabling organized crime. When customs officials were on smugglers' payrolls and prize court judges received kickbacks from privateers, the system wasn't just failing, it was actively supporting criminal enterprises. Today, we see similar dynamics when drug cartels corrupt police departments, when financial regulators come from and return to the industries they supposedly oversee, and when politicians receive campaign contributions from industries they regulate. The colonial pattern of legal corruption, where officials technically follow rules while enabling criminal behavior, remains a critical challenge for modern governance. The inability of colonial authorities to coordinate across colonial boundaries enabled criminals to exploit jurisdictional gaps, A smuggler caught in Boston could escape to Rhode Island and be untouchable. A counterfeiter in Connecticut could pass fake bills in New York with impunity. Modern organized crime exploits similar jurisdictional fragmentation. Cybercriminals operate from countries with weak extradition treaties. Financial fraudsters move money through international banking systems that don't share information. Human traffickers transport victims across state and national borders faster than law enforcement can coordinate responses. The colonial lesson is clear. Effective law enforcement requires coordination and information sharing across jurisdictions, something we're still struggling to achieve in the digital age. Perhaps the most important modern connection is the relationship between economic injustice and organized crime. Colonial smuggling flourished partly because British trade policies were economically oppressive. Many colonists saw smuggling not as crime, but as justified resistance to exploitation. Today, organized crime often thrives in communities facing economic desperation. Drug trafficking networks recruit in neighborhoods with few legitimate economic opportunities. Human smuggling operations exploit migrants fleeing poverty and violence. Counterfeit goods operations target communities where authentic products are unaffordable. While this doesn't excuse criminal behavior, it suggests that addressing organized crime requires addressing underlying economic conditions, a lesson colonial America teaches clearly. Colonial America's reliance on community-based law enforcement, constables, militias, community vigilance, failed to prevent organized crime. Yet the eventual replacement with professional police forces created its own problems: distance from communities, lack of accountability, and potential for abuse. Modern police reform debates circle this same tension. Community policing advocates argue for return to neighborhood-based, community-centered law enforcement, essentially a modern version of colonial constables. Critics warn this recreates the problems of colonial policing: inconsistency, bias, and inability to address sophisticated criminal networks. The colonial experience suggests we need a synthesis: professional law enforcement with community accountability, standardized training with local flexibility, and specialized capacity to address organized crime without sacrificing community trust. As we've journeyed through the shadowy world of colonial American crime rings, we've encountered a world both alien and disturbingly familiar. John Hancock's smuggling empire, Owen Sullivan's counterfeiting network, the DeWolf family's slave trading operation, and Philadelphia's privateering racket all demonstrate a profound truth. Organized crime thrives not in the presence of law enforcement, but in its absence, corruption, or ineffectiveness. The criminals we've explored were neither romantic rogues nor one-dimensional villains. They were products of a system that created perverse incentives, offered no legitimate paths to justice, and failed to provide basic institutional safeguards. Many colonists saw them not as criminals but as heroes fighting unjust authority. This moral ambiguity, where crime and patriotism, villainy and virtue, became hopelessly entangled, shaped American culture in ways we're still reckoning with today. The colonial experience offers crucial lessons for our own time. It shows us that law enforcement institutions, however imperfect, serve essential functions in preventing organized crime from dominating communities. It demonstrates that economic injustice creates conditions where criminal networks can present themselves as viable alternatives to legitimate society. It reveals how corruption corrodes not just government but community trust and social cohesion. And it warns us that some forms of crime, particularly those committed by the wealthy and well-connected, receive not just tolerance but celebration, perpetuating systems of injustice. Perhaps most importantly, colonial American crime rings force us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own society. How different are we really from those colonial communities that tolerated smuggling, looked away from counterfeiting, and participated in the profits of slave trading? Do we still grant impunity to respectable criminals while harshly punishing the poor and marginalized? Have we created our own jurisdictional gaps that sophisticated criminals exploit? Are our law enforcement institutions effective, accountable, and just, or do they replicate some of the failures we've examined in colonial systems? These aren't rhetorical questions. They demand serious engagement, reflection, and action. The absence of formal policing in colonial America created chaos that victimized communities for generations. But the creation of modern policing hasn't solved all problems. Sometimes it's created new ones. Finding the balance between effective law enforcement and accountable, just institutions remains one of our greatest challenges. As you reflect on the stories of John Hancock's midnight smuggling operations, Owen Sullivan's counterfeit empire, and the brutal efficiency of illegal slave trading networks, ask yourself, what would I have done? Would I have participated in smuggling to resist unjust taxation? Would I have remained silent about counterfeiting to avoid retaliation? Would I have invested in profitable slave trading ventures that funded my community's prosperity? History isn't just about judging the past. It's about understanding how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary injustice, and how societies create the conditions for either organized crime or legitimate order. The colonists who built America's first criminal empires weren't monsters. They were people responding to incentives, opportunities, and moral frameworks not so different from those we navigate today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think colonial America's lack of formal policing was a failure that enabled criminal chaos, or did later professional police forces simply create different problems? Could modern community policing movements learn anything from colonial law enforcement failures? And how do we balance the need for effective crime prevention with the imperative for justice, accountability, and community trust? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into America's hidden criminal history enlightening, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of the complex, often uncomfortable truths about America's past. Next time, we'll be examining another shadowy chapter of history that's been overlooked in traditional narratives. Remember, understanding history isn't about celebrating or condemning the past, it's about learning from it. The organized crime rings of colonial America flourished because institutions failed, communities compromised their values, and economic systems created perverse incentives. Those conditions can emerge anywhere, anytime. Recognizing them and choosing differently is how we honor those who suffered under systems that valued profit over humanity, order over justice, and power over truth. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.